He said, God bless you. In what you're doing here. He was at the top of those stairs. And he walked right back that little short sidewalk, took a right at that big pine tree, and headed for the front gate. Well, this doctor, of all people, was the only one in earshot. And he was back under some shrubs in the shade eating his lunch, and he piped up and he said, Ron, do you suppose we've been talking with an angel? And I said, at least. Well, I worked with great enthusiasm for the rest of that day. When we left the garden tube, I asked the ladies in there, I said, what did you think of that big, tall man dressed in ancient Jewish garb? They looked at me kind of funny. And they said, there's been nobody in here like that today. And then one of them said, well, Mr. Wyatt, there's never been anybody in here like that. So somewhere between where he turned right past that pine tree and before he got to the office, he went on to the New Jerusalem.
The uninvited guest eventually left, and they were able to resume work for a brief time. At this time, Ron made the following discovery.
Just a brief look around the surrounding areas here to identify the location of this site. Down to the left, of course, is down where the work is being done in the excavation. As you hear the electric jackhammer, we have been probing around up here by the cross hole, and just immediately to the left of the film container, you see some dark pigmented material. Now this appears to be dried blood, but we do plan to put some of this in the film case and take it back and have it analyzed to see if it is blood. Now this is right under the cutouts where Christ was crucified and near the cross hole that we believe to be the one he was crucified on. There, right at the very tip of the tab, there's some more of this real dark material. As soon as it's exposed to the light, it begins to turn a lighter brown, and this is typical of very old blood. So we'll take some more of this sample here, and it seems to have come down through this area here, as we've collected it all the way along and down into this crevice that communicates with the chamber that the Ark of the Covenant's in. It comes right down through here and down this way and around to a crack right in here and down through this area. Anyway, I have several samples of it that I have taken.
For many years, the specimen sat untouched. Then, in 1996, when Ron was in Great Britain, Richard and Elizabeth Reeves and their sons came to Nashville to our home. Richard had a new, unique, and very powerful microscope he wanted to show us.
Leviticus 17:14 informs us that the life of all flesh is the blood thereof. Once again, scientists are finding out that the truths of Scripture are far more literal than they ever imagined. Tiny particles have been discovered in blood that are seemingly indestructible. These tiny particles are less than 1/10 of a micron in size, and while they cannot be seen using standard medical microscopes, new methods of microscopy have been developed which makes it possible to see them in their living state. The French scientist Gaston Naessens designed special microscope components that would allow him to see these particles, which he entitled somatids, meaning the body that creates. Through experimentation, Professor Naessens found that these somatids contain genetic material yet to be fully understood by the scientific community. They are polymorphic in nature, growing from stage to stage, and are unaffected by high temperatures, extremely toxic chemicals, or even nuclear radiation. Professor Naessens believes these somatids to be subcellular living and reproducing entities, the precursor of DNA, and that they may be the building blocks of life. About 6 years ago, I learned about these particles as a result of some research that I was conducting, which was totally non-related to archaeology. At that time, I was using a standard medical microscope, and while I could not see these particles, I knew they had to be there. I began to develop my own microscope patterned after the design of Professor Naessens. What you see behind me is that microscope in its latest stage of development. The microscope employs an extremely bright xenon or mercury light source, which can be combined with tungsten light. The light is directed across the microscopic specimen rather than on or through it in what is known as a dark field configuration. The light reflecting off the object is transmitted through the microscope and is magnified over 1,000 times. The image is then captured by a sensitive CCD camera and transmitted to a monitor for viewing at screen magnifications of up to 30,000x. Under these conditions, the tiny living particles can plainly be seen against a dark background. In 1996, my family and I made a trip to Nashville to visit the Wyatts. I brought along the microscope, which at that time was somewhat portable in its early stage of development, and set it up in the basement of the Wyatts' house. One evening, Mary Nell Wyatt asked me to take a look at some material from a burial cave to see if these tiny particles were present. Without my knowledge, one of the samples was actually the blood sample that Ron had taken from the Ark of the Covenant dig. The sample was placed under the microscope, and as the specimen began to come into focus, thousands of tiny particles, somatids if you will, became plainly visible. At that time, Mary Nell, who was standing behind me, began to weep. As I turned around and saw the expression on her face, I realized immediately that the sample we were looking at was actually the sample that Ron had found to be the blood of Christ. Okay, Mary Nell's going to take the sample and mix it with sterile water. And a test tube there that we've that'll be enough.